Amen. For you that are still praying, you can continue to pray. I forgot to mention this as well. This is from Dave and Glenda Carter, our missionaries. They were missionaries to Japan. Now they're retired. They said, "Dear Pastor Hawkins and church family, thank you so much for the love gift that we received in the mail. We are so grateful and humbled by your sacrifice during these difficult financial times. May God richly bless you for your love and care for us. Please continue to pray with us for the churches in Japan to see a harvest of souls for the Lord." Love, Dave and Glenda Carter. And so if you want to see that, you're more than welcome to after the service. It's a pleasure to have Brother Darren with us tonight. He's an evangelist. He's been a pastor for 13 years. And I'm sure he'll talk about his website, Freedom Focus, and talk about the ministry that God has led him to. So he does use something like PowerPoint, and so just follow along with us if you would, brother. It's all yours. Come and give us the word of God, amen? And so let's let it rip.
Amen. Thank you. Appreciate it very much. Amen. What a blessing. It's good to be here tonight. And we rolled into town late Monday night, and I began to realized right away that this was truly a scriptural, biblical, New Testament church. First of all, because you had a prophet's chamber. I mean, all Bible churches have a prophet's chamber. Secondly, I was greeted by Paul and Stephen. I thought, well, hey, we're on a good path here. You know, we got some modern men of God. And by the way, they did a greet job as hosts and greeters. You would be proud, preacher. And then I get to the service and preacher says, "Preach till midnight." I mean, that's New Testament right there. I just want to make sure nobody's sitting by a window, right? Is this the third floor? Is it really? Second? Okay, well, anyway, close enough. So don't sit by a window, no matter how hot it gets, right? But, yeah, right, we'll have to watch the sound man. What a blessing. Thank you, and he was awesome too, trying to get us all fixed up here with our technology, so I appreciate his flexibility. When you have a flexible sound man, that's almost a paradox right there. It's just, what a blessing. You guys are blessed. Well, again, my name is Darren. This is my wife, Tammy. What I think I'll do is a kind of a quick version of the introduction because I really want to get into the message here. But since we've never been here before, and by the way, we've never even been to Massachusetts before. And we traveled pretty much every of the 48 lower states except this corner up here. And today we had breakfast in Vermont, and then we did lunch in New Hampshire, and we did supper in Maine, and we got here in time for church. So that was four of the states that we wanted to check off the list, you know. And I got a little bit of heartburn from that lobster, but anyway, it was awesome. We had a great time, and the Lord's been good to us, been able to kind of do some traveling, and this was kind of a spur-of-the-moment trip. It just happened, and so I appreciate Pastor being flexible. Anyway, I was a music and youth pastor for 15 years back in Missouri. That's my hometown, born and raised. There's home state. Born there, went to college there, went back to my home church and did music and youth. And then we moved up the road about an hour to Rolla, Missouri, and pastored for 13 years. Had a Christian school for about 10 years, Reformers Unanimous, and bus routes and all of that. So just had a great time there. During that time, we had Patriot Day rallies down at the park and basically trying to get the quotes from our founders to the average person on the street. Quotes that had to do with faith and the Bible and prayer and all of that. So it's a long story. I'm trying to keep it real short, leave out a lot of details. But we did that for 7 years, and our big year, we had 5,000 people at the park. Every year was except for the first year where it rained the entire time. Every year after that was very successful and truly blessed, and the community looked forward to it. And, of course, we're in Midwest, America, in the Bible Belt, but still, I figured we would get some pushback and have, some politically correct stuff thrown at us. But, I mean, we celebrated One Nation Under God and fireworks and activities for the kids, had special guest speakers, and we just did everything we could to get the quotes and the truths of our founders to average people who maybe have never heard this stuff before. you know. And it brought people out of the woodwork, you know, that were hungry for a good message like that was noble, honorable, uplifting. So the Lord kind of used that to launch us into ministry. We started about 6 years ago called Freedom Focus. That's our son Daniel. He traveled with us for 4 years, full time. And he's kind of doing his own ministry now aimed at 15 to 25-year-olds. If you're a young person or know a young person, his website is freedomists, freedomists.us. And so they do a lot of podcasts and videos aimed at the young people. But anyway, he's a tremendous blessing, and we've been honored to, I think we made it to 27 states or something like that to speak in churches or schools or Bible colleges. So that was great. We live in Branson, Missouri. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Branson, but it's there's probably 150 different shows. There's about 9 million visitors a year that come. So it's a tourist town, but it is definitely a God and country emphasis. It's kind of a cross-section of Christians and patriots. And they still say Merry Christmas, that's for sure. And they love the Lord. They have their Christmas parades end with the nativity, you know. So it's a wonderful part of the country. And I didn't move there for this reason, but we moved there to be close to my parents and our grandkids, which we have 5 of, by the way. I don't want to leave that out. And their ages 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So anyway, we decided about 3 years ago, prayed about it, and just asking the Lord, is there any way we could rent one of these theaters and do a patriotic presentation similar to what we've done with the rallies and a lot of the content that we use in our presentations, and make it a Branson show? You know, I mean, why not? You know, put the gospel in there, talk about this struggle for freedom. So we called it Freedom Journey, and we did that for the last 3 years. And the Lord really blessed that as well. I mean, kind of surprising because we didn't have a lot of name recognition or anything like that, just a brand new adventure. And yet the Lord really did bless it. We had a lot of folks that said, boy, this was great. My kids, my grandkids need to hear this. We had a lot of families there as well. A lot of interaction of drama, music, quotes, and then I kind of narrate the whole thing, so preaching, if you will. But, you know, it was something that the Lord just has really used over the last 3 years in our lives as well to show us that we can get this message to more people. And part of my burden with all of this is we're not, as Christians, doing a well enough job at teaching this generation. And the government schools have pretty much abandoned American history or try to make it revised into something that's a negative. And so they either revise it or they make it bad. And, you know, as God's people, we understand that the truth is what makes you free. In fact, it was Benjamin Franklin, of all people, that said it's in the region of ignorance that tyranny begins. He said we ought to have a Bible and a newspaper in every community read as it ought to be read daily. And that when people understand their rights, their God-given rights, only then can we preserve freedom for the next generation. They really believed, and I could give you quote after quote like that from the founders, that it boils down to education. If you don't educate the kids, you're never going to have self-government. It's never going to work. They have to be educated. They have to know what's going on. And they need to understand the principles of personal dignity and the purpose of government from a biblical perspective. So that's what this nation was built on, right? And we've had a blast going through Boston and seeing all the landmarks and the birthplace of liberty. But that's what these folks believe. They believe that you had to put God first. Well, we're losing that battle, but we want to do something. You know, we want to reach as many people as we can with the truth. So that kind of leads me to this next chapter that God's doing in our life, and we would like to build a museum in Branson that average people could just walk through with their families, or college kids, immigrants, whoever, maybe have never heard the American story. And there ought to be a museum that presents it from the faith perspective. And so, in other words, the struggle of tyranny, freedom, or faith, and freedom. because for thousands of years, that's really been the struggle. And I can't go into all that information tonight, but that's what we have focused on for the last several years. And we're really excited about taking that message and putting it into a walkthrough museum, similar to the Creation Museum, where you walk through a timeline. You're not necessarily, looking at artifacts. You're walking through the story. So the Holocaust Museum in D.C. is a good example of that. It's called an experiential museum, and that's what we would like to build, where young people who aren't going to read all the books and read the quotes can walk through, and hopefully they'll feel it and see it and hear it and come out the other end saying, wow, I had no idea. I had no idea that's what world history was like, and that's why America was born. So pray with us about this. We want to call it Freedom Encounter Museum of America's Founding. Actually, a friend of ours just purchased a building there in Branson, and this is the front of it. It looks like a museum to me. This is a theater that was not really old. It was built in '93 by Tony Orlando, if y'all remember him. Tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. But anyway, he built this thing, and a church bought it a few years back, and then it's been empty for a while. And we got it at a fifth of the price that they were asking. So since it was a church that owned it and they had already paid it off, and we were going to use it for ministry-related nonprofit, I think the Lord just worked. And so this is the front of it there with the 80-foot flagpole out front. Pretty nice. This is the foyer area. This is a bookstore to the right, the concession area there on the left. Tickets there in the middle. That's the skylight up above. It's just a really neat feature. This is the theater. Seats 2,000 people. So we're going to shrink it down to seat about 500, and then we'll build the walkthrough in part of that space, and then we'll build a children's play area, kind of like an indoor village where the kids can play Benjamin Franklin's invention shop and Betsy Ross's flag shop and a bakery and a one-room schoolhouse and things like that, a Liberty tree with a tree house. So that's our idea, is to have families, church groups, homeschool groups, civic groups, veterans groups come in and create an environment where they can just hang out for a while, walk through the museum, see a show about freedom, go to the bookstore, hopefully, and get this curriculum and take it home with them and educate the next generation. So we really are looking at it as an education center for freedom. When you combine the museum, the theater, which we're really excited about the theater, it's got the fly bridge system, so you can drop backdrops, and we can drop a screen that's kind of see-through that does a holographic effect. So you can have live with bringing George Washington and people back to life through the holograms, and then it's also suited for live speakers or an orchestra or a choir or whatever. There's unlimited possibilities and productions that can be done. So excited about that. Excited about the kids' play area, the bookstore, and then there's actually room in there for classrooms if we did seminars on socialism or pastors, what can pastors do to make a difference, or homeschool techniques to better educate your kids. So pray with us about this. It's a big deal. It's going to cost a lot of money, but in fact, the Lord has sent a guy along who was the head of development for Silver Dollar City and the Herschend family, which if you're familiar with that at all, I don't know, but they own about 32 properties. They're the largest attractions group in America, own Dollywood and Dixie Stampede and several parks like that. And then Billy, the guy who's helping us, also worked with Steve Green and the Hobby Lobby family to do the traveling museum, the Bible museum called Passages, that went around the country for a while before they built the one in D.C. So anyway, he has an excellent resume and lives right there in Branson. He's a believer. He believes in our project and has really teamed up with us to help make it happen. So we're praying for the personnel, and we're praying for the resources, and it looks like God's answering those prayers. But let's just if you see the news and you see how bad things are, and you see these man on the street interviews and a bunch of young people who don't even know what Independence Day is, I've seen some of those that just blow my mind. But when you see stuff like that, instead of getting angry or anxious, just pray for us. There's a lot of people trying to make a difference, but at least pray for us. If we, God can do big things out of small voices and people, and, this one place could make a big difference. You just don't know who's going to go through, who's going to be inspired. And we're pointing people back to the Creator, and we'll definitely have the gospel in there as well, like they would at the Creation Museum or the Ark Encounter, something like that. But we're excited, but we're also totally dependent on God. So if you'll pray with us and for us, I would deeply appreciate it. Okay, turn your Bibles, if you would, to Romans chapter 13. And I think I'm going to step down. It's not going to hurt if I step down, is it? You can follow me, and this won't scream at me? Okay, good. I just want to kind of be able to get in a position where we can see all this together. So we're going to take a walk through the founding documents. Honestly, most of this, though, is leading up to the founding documents, and then I'll take you through the main thought of each one. And, as a pastor and a youth pastor and educator, my interest in all of this is really from the spiritual perspective. Religious freedom, the ability for churches to assemble and to give out the gospel and support missionaries and do what we're called to do. I've never been a politician. I wasn't in the military. I've always been in the ministry. But I honestly am looking at this from the spiritual perspective, because that's the strength of America. Has always been her spiritual backbone and understanding about life. So let's just walk through. I'm going to lay a foundation here, and we'll start with just referring to Acts chapter 17, where Paul's given the sermon on Mars Hill. And he says, God that made the world and all things therein. He goes back to the Creator. And he says that God giveth to all life and breath and all things. The only reason you're alive is because God created you. Then he says he's made of one blood all nations of men. So every nation out there was actually created by God, right? In the Tower of Babel, he spread man out. And that's why we all have maybe different skin colors and different ethnic backgrounds, is simply because God split us up into countries, smaller communities or nations, the Bible says. But the truth is we're all cousins, right? I mean, it all goes back to Noah. It all goes back to Adam. It all goes back to the Creator. So verse 27, though, he tells us why were we created. That they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. So the whole reason for you to live on this earth is not to make money. It's not to be comfortable or to seek pleasure. It's certainly not to serve the state or the government or the king or whoever happens to be in power during your life. Why are you here? To seek the Lord, feel after him, and find him. If you missed that, you missed it all. That's why you're here. Now, the reason I point this out first is because there's dignity in your life, because you were created by God to know God, to walk with God, to find God. That's your purpose on this earth, and our founders understood that. So I'm going to lay that foundation, and we'll come back to it later. But I'm going to start with the first question here tonight, and just keep this real simple. I was a youth pastor for a long time, so I try to keep it down there on their level. But what is a nation? Ever stop to think about it? I've seen some of these banners and protesters carrying these placards that say, no walls, no borders, no nations. And there's a movement. George Soros and these others are for open borders, right? Open border society. We don't want nations. That's an interesting thing. Well, what is a nation? Why would that be a good thing or a bad thing? Here's the truth. God gave us nations. The first time nations is ever mentioned is in Genesis 10, 9 and 10, where God is talking about the Tower of Babel, and then he confused the languages, and he spread them out across the globe, and they became nations according to their language. Evolution has no explanation for why we have thousands of languages They can't even explain one language. They can't agree on why does man even speak at all, let alone why do we have hundreds, thousands of languages. But the Bible tells us God, at that moment, He judged man to spread them out. He confused their languages, and that's why we have a nation. By the way, it just makes sense to have a national language. Because you can't have a community if you can't communicate. So that's all Bible, really. That just goes back to the Genesis, back to the beginnings. So they would find someone they could talk like and go and gather with them. So it's really just a people group banded together as a civil society. What is a nation? It's just practical, really. You got a bunch of people that live together on the same island or the same place. Well, they need to function, right? They're going to cooperate, hopefully, with each other. You don't want to just live in a hut and totally be afraid of everybody else. You want to get out there and function as a group. What's the word civil mean? Civil just means you have rules and you agree to abide by them. If you're uncivil, you don't have rules, or you won't. The community, the society won't submit to those rules. That's uncivil. Civilization means man coming together to agree on some rules so we can function together. Because the truth is, we would like to buy things from each other. We would like to sell things to each other. We would like to trade. We would like to protect each other from common enemies out there that might come in and just burn the whole place down. We want to team up, right, so that we can protect each other. Also, after you spend time with people, you develop a culture, just like a church, activities and potluck dinners and things like, man, that was fun. We ought to do that again. And nations do the same thing. Every nation on earth has their colors, their music, their architecture, their sports, right? And we can go down the list because they've lived together so long. So all a nation is practically is a group of people that live together. Now, I'm going to ask you another question. Who's going to decide the rules? If civil means you have rules, who's going to decide those rules? Right? I mean, is it one person that steps in and says, I'll tell you what the rules are? Or do you sit down and have a meeting? We're going to have rules. Speed limits, traffic lights, all that stuff. You can't play basketball if you don't have rules. I mean, you can try, it just won't last very long, right? It'll end up, or you can do the honor system, which is call your own foul. And I've been in plenty of games with plenty of people, and unless you are superb Christians, that's going to break down sooner or later, or you don't care. If you just don't care who wins or whatever, then maybe it'll work. But if you're serious, you better have some rules and you better establish them at first, right? So that everybody's on the same page. Think about an intersection. As simple as that is, two roads crossing. If we don't have rules, it's going to be bad, isn't it? Somebody's going to get hurt, somebody's going to get killed. And that's just one example, but think about all the things. We need to agree on some rules and we need to submit to those rules. Now, next question. Who's going to enforce those rules? Right? I had a Christian school for 10 years. If you're not going to enforce the rule, don't even waste your time writing it down. Right? Don't put it in a handbook unless you are ready to enforce it. True? Mom, Dad, you got kids. If it's a rule, you better be prepared to enforce it. And if not, the kids are going to test you and try you and find out if you're serious or not. But it doesn't matter what age. I was driving today and there were people flying past me and I'm looking at the speed limit sign's 55. Well, in Missouri, people drive 55 if it says 55. Well, not really, but here I'm like, I kind of fuzzed a little bit and went over 5 or 10 and people were flying past me. And I felt like I was going to get hit, it's part of my reason I better speed up a little bit here. But, okay, so what's the deal? Somebody made a rule, but they're not enforcing it. So what does man do? Whatever he can get away with. Now, sadly, this is human nature. I wish it wasn't this way. Wouldn't it be nice if we would just all do the right thing all the time? Just, honor your neighbor, love your neighbor as yourself. We're sorry. We're a sorry lot. And the truth is, the reason we have to have government is because of our sin nature. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't need all the rules and the enforcement. So if you're playing basketball, that guy's going to enforce the rules. If you're driving through an intersection, that guy's going to enforce the rules. But you do have to have an enforcer. So next question. What is government? I think it's probably a really good idea for America to stop and ask this question. Some things you're around your whole life, you grow up with it, you don't ever question it. But maybe we should. What is government? Well, the dictionary definition, those who govern, control, or preside over a community or nation. Those who, I could say it this way, those who are in charge of enforcing the rules. Those who are going to know what the rules are and enforce them. That really is government. Romans chapter 12, you're there close, and you can look at these verses with me, but that last part of the chapter is talking about this principle that executing justice is not your job on a personal level. So every one of us have a strong sense of justice. If somebody hurts me, I want them to hurt. I don't know why. It's just the way it is, right? You hurt me, you cut me off in traffic. Why? We've all got this justice strong in us. But God said, I don't want you to track down the people who have hurt you and hurt them back. That's no quality of life. Now, we're surrounded by sinners and that we're going to be offended. But, the psalmist said that we're not easily offended if we love God's law. If His word is in us, we're not just trigger happy, ready to just fly off at somebody. Proverbs is full of verses like that. Don't seek revenge. Leave that to God. Let that go. If you see here in Romans 12, he says it this way in verse 17, recompense to man evil for evil. Evil to you or your family, you're not supposed to go after him on your own and make him pay. Verse 19 says, avenge not for yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, the Lord. So you're trusting God to execute vengeance, and you can just let it go. Right? Now this is hard. This takes faith. You've got to believe that God's actually going to deal with that, because something in you says, I don't want them to get away with this. Right? I'll make sure they pay. But you're never going to have the joy of the Lord that way. And you're never going to have the peace that passes understanding. And you're not going to be able to lay your head down at night and know that you're right with God and your fellow man and that you've released all that. No, you're going to sit there and stew in your anger. And so God says, look, I don't want you to live that way. Trust me. God says, I'll take care of it. I will take care of it. Now, it's amazing that Romans 13 follows Romans 12. You know what Romans 13 is about, right? Human government. The powers that be. Isn't it interesting? Of course, there's no chapter break in the original letter that Paul wrote. And so, really, in chapter 13, he's saying that executing justice is the government's job. So he's continuing the thought, and he says, now evil is out there, and evil has to be dealt with. So here's how God says evil is going to be dealt with. Verse 1, let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there's no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. These powers or these authorities, these realms of responsibility are created by God, given permission by God. We can trace that back to Genesis 9. So if you think with me for a moment, there's no government before the flood, right? There was no courts, no judges, no police force, no military. And what happened? Well, pretty much every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And what happened? It led to every imagination of his heart was only evil continually. Evil not just meaning you sinned, but you hurt someone. It's the idea of harming someone or hurting someone. Evil continually. unchecked, not stopped. And then he said the earth was filled with wickedness and violence. So, before government, now God gave us the home, government, and the church. Those are the only three things, institutions that God gave us. So he gave us the home first, Genesis 2. Genesis 9, Noah gets off the ark, and God says, we're going to do things different. All right, from now on, welcome to your new world, rainbow, all of that. But let me tell you something else. We're going to have capital punishment. What does that mean? Well, he said whenever someone kills someone, man will take that person's life. Now, obviously, that's not personal revenge because the dead guy can't do it. Right? So this isn't one-on-one. You're going to pay people back. He said mankind. So you're going to organize somehow, go catch the murderer, give him a trial, get all the evidence, make sure it was him, figure out how to be just about this. But then if you know it's him, you take his life. It's capital punishment. He forfeited his life because he killed someone else. Now, there's a lot in that, but basically God is saying from now on, before there wasn't anything like that, right? So if you killed someone, it's just like the Wild West, everywhere. I mean, it's just every man for himself. God said, we're not going to function that way, and what we're going to do is I'm giving you permission to track him down and take his life. That is the beginning of human government. That's why this verse says these powers are ordained of God. The murderer sure didn't like the idea that others were going to track him down and take his life. That was God's idea, and it's for our good. And what it does, it executes justice or wrath on evil, and it protects the innocent. And in that statement right there, you have the biblical definition of government. And I've been preaching this for a long time now, studying cover to cover in the Bible. I haven't seen anywhere where God said the government should feed you. And I'm just throwing it out there. This isn't personal. I have no idea who's in the room. And we've kind of all been conditioned to let government do more and more and more for us. But I'm just saying, what is the biblical God-given purpose? It's to protect you from evil so you can get out there and provide for your family and go to church and do God's will. Seek after the Lord, feel after Him, and find Him. So government really is a lot like the referees. They need to know the rules and they need to enforce them. But the referees don't play the game, do they? That's not their role. When they became a referee, they decided, well, I'm not actually playing the game right now. I'm a referee. And if the referees are not just, or they tip the scale, or they do something abusive, we fire that referee and get somebody in there who can do it right. And we teach our kids, you honor that ref. Even though they're human, they will make mistakes. They're not perfect, but you honor that ref. And it's the exact same principle really with law enforcement and government. So he goes on in verse 2 and says, whosoever resisteth this power, resists the ordinance or the plan, design of God. And they that resist shall receive. That means judgment by God or judgment by man. So, if you're going to resist the authorities that God has granted in human government, you will be judged by God and by man. Verse 3 says, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Now, in that one verse, God is saying, putting boundaries around government. And He's saying, government is not here to terrorize good people. Government, God never intended for government to tell the pastor how he can preach, when he can preach, what he can preach. God never intended for government to oversee the church and issue licenses and get permission from the government so we could have a church. God never meant for government to be in charge of your kids and their education. I mean, the Bible's very clear. Parents, raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And that's your job. That job's never given to Caesar or Pharaoh or the government. Now, government loves taking over these jobs, and there's reasons for that, and that's a whole different sermon, so I'm trying to stay on track. But God said, look, they're not here to go after good people trying to do the will of God. Acts 17, seek after the Lord, feel Him, find after Him. He's right there by you. Give your life to seeking God and doing what God put you here to do. What He put in your heart to do. Do it. And now government, protect these people while they do it. Government's not supposed to be God. They're not supposed to kick God out and become God so that you worship government. But that's how most governments throughout time have acted. It's an abuse of what God gave us. So God's very clear, you protect the good. In fact, in Peter he says, praise those that do good and condemn the evil. That's government's job. Verse 4, He's a minister of God to thee for good. Thank God you can call 911 and get the police in here. And I'm telling you, all this stuff about defund the police. Really? And no, we're going to take $1 million or $1 billion, whatever it is, in these different cities. We're going to take that money from the police and do what with it? Give it to welfare programs? Social programs? Well, the Bible told you to do this. The Bible did not tell you to do this. So, what's going on? I wonder who's behind this. Because this is not God's idea. If anything, we need to be cutting this. Maybe giving more tax breaks and folks for charities and all that. I mean, we want a heart of compassion. We want people to have their needs met through their job, through their family, through their church, through the charities in their community. But not through government. But exactly what we see going on is let's diminish their ability to do what God told them to do and increase their ability to do what they're not supposed to be doing. It's kind of bizarre to me. That just popped up in the last few weeks. I've been teaching this for years, and it's just amazing how these truths keep applying to the daily news. But anyway, verse 4 says, if thou do that, so God gave the police officer permission to carry, it would be a sword, but nowadays it's a gun. If he can't use lethal force to stop evil, what he's supposed to do? God said he can use it. Now, obviously, if he abuses it, we all are against that. That'd be like the referee who has the authority to kick that kid out of the game. Call 5 fouls, or the guy, slams the ball on the floor, so the ref says you're out of the game. Go home. Go to the locker room. Okay, we understand. But we didn't give that referee permission to punch the kid or to curse at the kid, right? I mean, that's no. And everyone in that gym would rise up and say, that's wrong, you're out of bounds, you're fired, whatever we got to do. And so with a police officer, there's obviously any human could abuse their power. But this idea of painting them all bad, we've just got to be really careful. We've got to be careful and understand God's purpose and plan in human government. And thank God that we can call 911 and get somebody here to deal with this. Otherwise, you're going to have to deal with it. So here we go. He's a minister of God to revenge and execute wrath on him that doeth evil. So we're well on our way to midnight. Let me see what I can do to speed this up. How are we going to govern ourselves? There's not that many options. And honestly, it's easy to complain about what's going on in America and all this. And our Declaration, our Constitution, plenty of people complain. All right, stop. If we started over right now, if we all just moved to an island, we had no government, no IRS, no anything, how long would it take before we need some rules? The preacher's always the first one to respond when I ask that, because he knows, If you got people together, you need rules like right away. Courtesy, land rights and boundaries and all of it. How long would it take before we need to enforce those rules? Probably not very long, because even in a group of good Bible-believing people, there's somebody in here, and I don't know who you are, but you had the attitude, well, that rule doesn't really apply to me. Well, I don't think that's a very smart rule. Well, that works most of the time, but not today. Today's the exception, right? So don't look at anyone right now, but even in a group of good people, that's how we are. We'll do whatever we can get away with. So we got this island, we're there, couple guys get in a fight, and we want order, right? God is a God of decency and order. So what are we going to do? Who's in charge? Right? All of us? One of us? Some of us? That's the dilemma. God said, structure, set up government. Do it. Because evil needs to be dealt with, and innocent people who are just trying to play the game need to be protected so they can finish the course. But the question is how? There's not too many options. I'll throw them out here for you. Number one, you could have the rule of no one. We will have no government on this island. We'll have no government in our little chop zone. Right? No government. Well, wait. I can tell you how that's going to end before it ever gets there. Because you're filled with humans, and humans are sinners. And we've already tried this before. You want to know what it looks like to have no government? Go back to Genesis 6. That's what it looks like. So anyway, the word for that is anarchy, and our founders were very well aware of all these options. So they're extremely well-educated people. It's amazing, in fact. But they know that anarchy is chaos. You can't have no one in charge. Unfortunately, now someday maybe in heaven, God will be in charge, but the sin nature will be gone, and it'll just be a whole... That's what we're longing for. That's what man is trying to create on earth, but it isn't going to happen on earth. So you can sing Imagine all you want, and you can read these, books about utopias and stuff all you want. But we're sinful human beings. That's the problem. We're not going to have utopia on earth. That's heaven. Number two, you can have the rule of majority. So in other words, on our island, we're all going to be in charge. There's actually a word for that. It's called democracy. It means the rule of the people. Now, the founders were very well of democracies. They didn't like democracies. And by the way, America is not a democracy. So in a democracy, what you would do is say, all right, our two guys got in a fight. Somebody says, hey, everybody, let's get together. What are we going to do with these two guys? They're fighting. And we can't let this continue. Well, all of us then say, well, I think you ought to do this. I think you ought to do that. Let's say we boil it down to two options. We have a vote. 51% say we're going to do plan A. Okay, the people have decided you two are going to submit to this. It's plan A. Everyone go back to your homes until the next problem. Come on back together. We got to make a decision. This guy pulled up on our shores and he's wanting to buy land and whatever, and we haven't really addressed this. What are we going to do? So we hash it all out, and we all come up with plan A and plan B, and we vote 51%. It's called rule by 51%. Some people call it mob rule. If you can get people worked up, and you can get at least 51% of them to agree at that given moment that we ought to do this, that's democracy. The founders saw that as very unstable. You don't want the majority back and forth on a whim, making up the rules as we go. Could you imagine playing basketball that way? It's just, you can't function. And they knew it was impractical. What are you going to do when there's 300 million people? You think we're going to all get together? So, the press loves to throw this word democracy around. America is not a pure democracy, a true democracy. We're democratic in the sense that it's a government of the people. But it's not a democracy, it's a republic. We'll get to that in a second. So you can have the rule of the few. That's an oligarchy. That just means you got a small group of 6 or 9 or 10, 12 people. The founders were well aware of Greece and other places that tried oligarchies, and they don't work either. It's too easy to manipulate 6 people. It's too easy to just, whisper in the ears of those 6 people, I'll kill your grandkids if you don't do what I just told you to do. And you go around to all 6 of them, and you're running the country. I mean, it doesn't work. So, okay, it's a group. Well, that doesn't work. Oligarchies, you can have the rule of one. The word for this is monarchy, right? And that just means, okay, it's a lot easier if just one guy's in charge. Let him make the decisions. We'll all do what he says. And I don't have to vote. I don't have to study. I don't need to know what's really going on. Just whatever that guy says, that's what we're going to do. Do you realize by far that's how most nations have been run? By one person. There's a really good book we usually carry on our table called From Change to Chains. And William Federer documents history, lays out all the different kinds of governments, and it's amazing how power concentrates back into one person. Even if, experiments with republics, experiments with democracies, sooner or later they break down and the power goes back to one person. This has happened over and over. And when power gets into one person's hands, it's never good. Just look at history. We got 6,000 years to look back. It's never been good. In fact, that's what tyranny is. It's producing a tyrant. He's not subject to any written law.